October 14th, 1943, 7:23 a.m., Thorpe Abbotts, England. The smell of coffee and aviation fuel mixed in the cold morning air as Captain Robert MacMillan walked across the hard stand toward his B-17F Flying Fortress. His boots crunched on gravel still wet from overnight rain, each step echoing in the pre-dawn quiet that hung over the 100th bomb group like a held breath. Above him, the bomber loomed massive and dark against the lightning sky. Four Wright Cyclone engines silent for now, propellers motionless, the aircraft's aluminum skin beaded with moisture that caught the first pale light. Painted on the nose in careful script was the name Lucky Strike. Chosen by the crew after their first 5 missions came back without serious damage, a streak so unusual in the 8th Air Force that other crews had started touching the bomber's fuselage before their own missions, hoping some of that luck would transfer. Mac reached up and ran his hand along the cold metal of the fuselage just below the pilot's window, a ritual he performed before every mission, and felt the rivets under his palm, each one hammered in by workers at Boeing's Seattle plant who would never know if their work lived or died over Germany. Today they were going back to Schweinfurt, back to the ball-bearing factories that fed the Nazi war machine, back to the most heavily defended target in the Third Reich, where 6 weeks earlier the 8th Air Force had lost 60 bombers in a single day and learned that daylight precision bombing came with a price measured in burning aircraft and unopened parachutes. If you want to hear stories of impossible survival and the thin line between life and death at 25,000 feet, subscribe now, because what happened to Lucky Strike that day defies every law of probability and physics. The mission to Schweinfurt represented everything that was brutal and necessary about the American daylight bombing campaign in '43. While the British RAF had switched to night bombing after suffering catastrophic losses in daylight raids, the Americans remained committed to precision attacks on specific industrial targets. The theory was elegant: destroy the factories producing critical components like ball bearings, and you cripple the entire German war machine. One factory complex in Schweinfurt produced 52% of Germany's ball-bearing output, components essential for everything from tank tracks to aircraft engines. Destroy Schweinfurt's factories, and you could theoretically ground the Luftwaffe and halt Panzer production simultaneously. The reality was considerably less elegant. Schweinfurt sat 400 miles inside Germany beyond the range of P-47 Thunderbolt escorts with their limited fuel capacity. This meant the bomber formations would fly the final 200 miles without fighter protection, running a gauntlet of Luftwaffe interceptors and flak batteries that had been reinforced after the August 17th raid. German defenders had 6 weeks to prepare for the Americans' inevitable return. They had positioned 246 heavy flak guns around Schweinfurt, dug in fighter squadrons at nearby airfields, and established a sophisticated early warning network that tracked bomber formations from the moment they crossed the English coast. The 8th Air Force knew all this. They had reconnaissance photos showing the flak positions, intelligence reports detailing the fighter reinforcements, and casualty projections that ranged from pessimistic to catastrophic. They were sending 291 B-17s anyway, because the strategic calculus was merciless. If losing 60 bombers meant destroying ball-bearing production for 6 months, that was a trade worth making. The men climbing into those bombers understood the arithmetic differently. They counted missions, not strategic objectives. Each crew needed to complete 25 missions to go home. Most crews didn't make it past 10. Mac's crew had completed 19 missions. 6 more and they'd be done. 6 more and they could stop watching their friends' aircraft explode in midair, stop counting empty bunks in the barracks, stop calculating the odds that today would be the day their luck ran out. Co-pilot First Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Patterson was already in the right seat running through the pre-flight checklist when Mac climbed through the nose hatch and made his way up to the flight deck. Patterson was 22 years old, a former engineering student from Pittsburgh who spoke in precise technical language and never showed emotion. Oil pressure good, fuel transfer working, hydraulics nominal, Patterson reported without looking up from his clipboard. Engines 1 through 4 pre-flighted, oxygen system charged. We're carrying maximum ordnance, 10 500-pound general-purpose bombs, total load 5,000 pounds. Fuel load 2,780 gallons. Gross weight, 65,000 pounds, which puts us 1,000 pounds over maximum recommended takeoff weight, but within emergency limits. Mac settled into the left seat and began his own scan of the instruments. The B-17F was a marvel of American engineering and also a death trap with wings. Four was 200 horsepower radial engines gave it the power to haul 5 tons of bombs across Europe. But those same engines drank fuel at a rate that left zero margin for error. The defensive armament, 1350 caliber machine guns positioned in nose, chin, waist, ball, tail, and top turret positions, could put out an impressive volume of fire, but German fighters had learned to attack from angles where that firepower was least effective. The aircraft's structural strength was legendary. B-17s had returned to base with entire sections of wing missing, tails shot away, engines torn off. But that strength meant nothing if a single 20-millimeter cannon shell found the oxygen system, or the bomb bay, or the fuel tanks that sat unprotected in the wings. Behind and below the flight deck, the rest of the crew was settling into their positions. Bombardier Second Lieutenant David Chen, a mathematics prodigy from San Francisco, who could calculate wind drift and altitude corrections in his head faster than the Norden bombsight's mechanical computer, was arranging his equipment in the nose compartment. Navigator Second Lieutenant Michael O'Brien, a former merchant marine officer from Boston, who navigated by dead reckoning with an accuracy that seemed supernatural, was plotting their route on maps that showed every known flak battery between England and Schweinfurt. Flight engineer Technical Sergeant Paul Kowalski, a machinist from Detroit who knew every system on the B-17 intimately and had twice kept damaged engines running through sheer force of will and creative bypassing of safety protocols, was checking fuel distribution from his position behind the pilots. Radio operator Technical Sergeant Raymond Clark, a former ham radio enthusiast from Kansas who could coax signals through jamming and static that defeated other operators, was testing communications equipment and configuring the liaison sets that would keep them connected to the formation. Ball turret gunner Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington, a former Golden Gloves boxer from Chicago, whose small frame made him perfect for the cramped sphere beneath the aircraft's belly, was inspecting the twin 50 calibers that would be his only company for the next 8 hours. Waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Anthony Moretti and Staff Sergeant Jack Thompson, best friends from Brooklyn, who had enlisted together and requested assignment to the same crew, were loading ammunition belts and checking their gun mounts that would leave them exposed to slipstream and temperatures 40 degrees below zero. Tail gunner Staff Sergeant William Billy Harris, a farm boy from Iowa who had never been in an airplane before joining the Army Air Force and now lived in the loneliest position on the bomber. 8 feet behind the rest of the crew in a cramped compartment where he would see the attacks coming, but could do nothing except shoot back and hope, was settling into his isolated station and checking the intercom that was his only connection to the rest of the crew. At 7:45 a.m., the operations officer's Jeep rolled down the flight line, and the officer stood up and fired a green flare into the gray morning sky. One by one, starting with the lead aircraft, the Wright Cyclone engines began to start. The sound began as individual coughs and sputters, each engine protesting against the cold morning air before catching and settling into a rough idle, and then the sound multiplied and compounded as more engines started until the entire airfield throbbed with the combined roar of over 1,000 radial engines running simultaneously, a mechanical thunder that shook the ground and made conversation impossible. Mac ran through the engine start sequence with the practiced efficiency of 19 previous missions. Engine 3 first, the inboard right, because it powered the primary hydraulic pump. Then engine 4, then engines 1 and 2 on the left side. Each engine required precise throttle and mixture control. Each one had its own temperament and quirks that Mac had learned over months of flying. Engine 2 ran slightly rough at idle but smoothed out at cruise power. Engine 4 tended to overheat if you pushed it too hard during climb. Engine 1 was perfect, never complained, never varied, the most reliable engine Mac had ever flown behind. Engine 3 had been replaced after the last mission when a piece of flak had punched through the cowling and damaged the cylinder head, and the new engine was still being broken in, still learning its job. At 8:02 a.m., the lead aircraft began to move, and one by one the B-17s of the 100th Bomb Group rolled out from their hard stands and formed up in a taxi line that stretched nearly a mile. Lucky Strike was positioned in the low squadron, third aircraft from the lead, a position called Purple Heart Corner by the crews because it attracted the heaviest fighter attacks. The low squadron flew 500 feet below the lead, and high squadrons, which meant German fighters diving on the formation, would reach the low squadron first and often concentrate their attacks there before climbing away. Flying Purple Heart Corner for 19 missions and surviving was statistically improbable. Flying it for a 20th time felt like pushing luck past its breaking point. At 8:17 a.m., the lead aircraft rolled onto the runway, ran its engines up to full power, and began its takeoff roll. Every 30 seconds, another bomber followed. When Lucky Strike's turn came, Mac lined up on the runway center line, set the brakes, and pushed the throttles forward to 2,300 RPM. The aircraft shook and strained against the brakes as 4,800 horsepower fought to move 65,000 pounds of aluminum, steel, beams, fuel, and 10 human beings. Mac scanned the engine instruments one final time. Oil pressure good, cylinder head temperature nominal, manifold pressure rising, and released the brakes. The B-17 lurched forward, slowly at first, then gathering speed as the engines overcame inertia. At 60 miles per hour, Mac could feel the tail wheel lift. At 90 miles per hour, he eased back on the yoke and felt the main gear leave the runway. At 100 miles per hour, they were airborne, climbing slowly as Mac retracted the gear and began the long process of gaining altitude. The formation assembly took 90 minutes. A complex aerial ballet where 291 bombers from multiple groups climbed through cloud layers and circled over specific radio beacons, gradually organizing themselves into combat boxes, wing formations, and group elements. Each bomber had to find its assigned position relative to dozens of other aircraft, maintain precise spacing and altitude, and do all of this while flying at maximum gross weight with minimal visibility through morning overcast. By 9:45 a.m., the formation was complete, an aerial armada stretching across 5 miles of English sky, and Mac could see dozens of B-17s in every direction, their silver forms glinting in the sunlight above the clouds. At 10:03 a.m., the formation turned east and headed for Germany. The flight across the English Channel and over occupied France was routine, which meant hours of tedium punctuated by moments of terror as flak batteries tracked the formation and sent up curtains of exploding steel. The bomber stream climbed steadily, reaching 23,000 feet by the time they crossed into Germany, and the temperature in the aircraft dropped to 20 degrees below zero, despite the weak sunlight streaming through the windows. In the waist, Moretti and Thompson huddled against the cold, their electrically heated suits providing minimal protection against the wind that howled through the open gun positions. In the ball turret, Washington was already experiencing the first signs of frostbite on his fingers despite his gloves, the cramped sphere beneath the aircraft catching the full force of the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream. In the tail, Harris sat alone with his thoughts and his guns in the empty sky behind the formation, watching for the fighters he knew would come. At 11:37 a.m., the P-47 Escort reached the limit of their fuel range and turned back toward England, waggling their wings in farewell before peeling away and leaving the bombers to face the next 200 miles alone. The intercom had been relatively quiet during the escorted portion of the flight, just occasional navigation updates from O'Brien and systems checks from Kowalski. Now the chatter picked up as gunners began calling out contacts. Bandits, 2 o'clock high, looks like a dozen plus. I count 15 at 9 o'clock level, FW-190s. ME-109s at 6 o'clock, they're forming up for an attack run. The German fighters had been shadowing the formation for 30 minutes, staying just out of range while more fighters joined them from airfields across Germany. Now, with the American escorts gone, they began their attacks. The first pass came from 12 o'clock high, 6 FW-190s diving nearly vertically through the formation with their 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns firing continuously. The combined defensive fire from 30 B-17s created a visible cone of tracers reaching up toward the attackers, and Mac saw one FW-190 stagger as hits registered along its wing, but the other 5 bored through the fire and flashed past Lucky Strike close enough that Mac could see the German pilot's face for a fraction of a second. Explosions bloomed throughout the formation as cannon shells found targets. A B-17 in the high squadron took a direct hit in the number 3 engine, and the engine erupted in flames that spread rapidly across the wing. Mac watched as the crew began to bail out, white parachutes blossoming against the blue sky, and counted 7 chutes before the bomber fell away in a spiraling dive. One engine still burning, trailing black smoke that marked its descent. The intercom erupted with combat chatter. "Got him! FW going down at 3 o'clock. Me-109 making a pass from 6 o'clock level. Tracking. He's firing. Nose to pilot, I see fighters forming up ahead. Looks like they're going to hit us head on. Ball to crew, we got a damaged B-17 falling out of formation below us, shoots in the air." The head-on attacks were the most terrifying because they gave the bomber crew less than 2 seconds from the time they saw muzzle flashes until the German fighter flashed past. And during those 2 seconds, approximately 40 20mm cannon shells and 150 machine gun bullets were traveling toward the B-17 at a combined closing speed of 550 miles per hour. Chen in the nose and the top turret gunner would fire back, but hitting a fighter-sized target at that closure rate was more luck than skill. Mac flew straight and level, holding position in the formation, because breaking formation meant isolation, and an isolated bomber was a dead bomber. The second wave of attacks came from 5 o'clock low, 6 Me-109s climbing into the formation's belly, where the defensive fire was weakest. Washington in the ball turret engaged immediately, his twin 50 calibers hammering as he tracked a 109 through a climbing left turn. "I'm hitting him! I'm hitting him!" Washington's voice crackled over the intercom, and then, "He's smoking! He's going down!" But the other 5 109s pressed their attacks, and Mac felt the B-17 shudder as cannon shells impacted somewhere aft. "Waist to pilot, we're hit! Holes in the fuselage, I see daylight through the skin!" Moretti's voice was tight but controlled. "No systems damage that I can see. Thompson's okay, continuing defensive fire." The attacks continued for 90 minutes without pause, wave after wave of German fighters hitting the formation from every angle, and the sky filled with tracers and cannon flashes, and pieces of aircraft and parachutes and falling bombs from damaged aircraft salvoing their loads. Mac lost count of how many bombers he saw go down. The formation's tight defensive box began to loosen as damaged aircraft fell behind or broke away, and the gaps created opportunities for German fighters to exploit. At 1:14 p.m., the lead bombardier called, "Initial point, bomb run begins in 30 seconds. This was the most vulnerable part of any mission, the 8 to 10 minutes where the bombers had to fly absolutely straight and level on the final approach to the target, making no evasive maneuvers while the bombardier adjusted the Norden bomb sight and synchronized with the lead aircraft. Any deviation would scatter the bombs and ruin the precision that was the entire justification for daylight bombing. The German fighters knew this, and their attacks intensified. The flak batteries around Schweinfurt opened up, and the sky ahead turned into a solid wall of black explosions, each one sending jagged steel fragments through a lethal radius of 200 feet. Mac flew into that wall because there was no choice, no way around, no alternative except forward through hell and out the other side if they were lucky. "Pilot to crew, flak ahead looks heavy. Call out any damage immediately." Mac's voice was steady despite the fear coiling in his chest like a living thing. The first flak bursts appeared as black flowers blooming directly ahead, and then Lucky Strike was in the middle of it, and the world became noise and violence. Each burst was a sharp crack loud enough to hear over the engines, and Mac could feel the concussions through the control column, feel the aircraft being pushed and buffeted by blast waves from explosions that came close enough to kill but not quite close enough. "Flak hit on the right wing," Kowalski's voice cut through the intercom. "I see holes, multiple punctures, but the wing's holding. No fuel leaks visible." Another burst closer this time, and Mac heard shrapnel ringing against the fuselage like someone throwing gravel against a tin roof. "Nose to pilot, we got flak damage down here. Equipment is torn up, but I'm okay." Chen's voice was shaky but functional. "Bomb sight might be damaged. I'm checking now." "Radio to pilot, I got holes in the radio compartment. Radios are out. I'm bleeding a little bit, but it's not bad." The flak intensified as they approached the target, the German gunners firing in patterns designed to create an impenetrable box barrage that forced the bombers to fly through concentrated explosions, regardless of their altitude or heading. Mac saw a B-17 in the lead squadron, take a direct hit in the bomb bay, and the aircraft simply vanished in a massive explosion as 10 500-pound bombs detonated simultaneously, the blast so powerful that it damaged aircraft 100 yards away. Bombardier to pilot, I've got the target. Synchronizing with lead. Bomb bay doors open. Mac reached up and toggled the bomb bay door switch and felt the drag increase as the huge doors swung open beneath the aircraft, exposing the bombs to the slipstream and to the flak that was now so thick, Mac could see individual fragments tumbling through the air. Steady! Steady! Bombs away! Mac felt the aircraft lift slightly as 5,000 pounds dropped free and watched as the bombs fell away toward the factories 23,000 feet below, tumbling slightly until their fins stabilized them, and then they were gone into the smoke and industrial haze that obscured the target. Bomb bay doors closed. Let's get the hell out of here. Chen's voice carried relief that they'd finished their job and could now focus entirely on survival. Mac began a slow turn to the left, following the lead aircraft as the formation came off the target and headed west toward home. But the German fighters weren't finished, and neither was the flak. The running battle continued for another hour, fighters attacking continuously from every angle, while flak batteries along the route fired predictive barrages at the bomber stream. Lucky Strike's guns fired almost continuously. The 50 calibers hammering out rounds at 800 per minute, spent brass casings piling up on the floor of the waist and tail positions, gun barrels glowing red hot despite the sub-zero temperatures. At 2:33 p.m., approximately 40 miles west of Schweinfurt, it happened. A burst of flak appeared directly ahead, slightly high, close enough that Mac instinctively tensed against the impending impact. The blast wave hit first, slamming the B-17 sideways hard enough that Mac was thrown against his shoulder harness. Then came the sound of impact, hundreds of distinct metallic pings and cracks as shrapnel tore through the aircraft, and Mac felt the control column jerk in his hands as fragments severed or damaged control cables. Jesus Christ, Patterson's voice broke his usual calm. Did you see that? That was close. Pilot to crew, damage report. Everybody sound off. Mac ran through a mental checklist even as he tested the controls, finding the rudder slightly mushy but functional, the elevators responding normally, the ailerons requiring more force than usual but still effective. Tail okay. I got some new ventilation back here, but nothing serious. Waist okay. More holes. Thompson took a small fragment in the leg, but he says he's good. Ball okay. I can't believe we're still flying. Radio, I'm okay. Equipment is junk, but I'm fine. Bombardier okay. Nose is shot to hell, but system's still working. Engineer okay. I see damage to the engines, but they're all still running. Navigator okay. I think we just used up all our luck. But O'Brien was wrong. They hadn't used up their luck. They'd barely started. Over the next 90 minutes, as Lucky Strike fought its way west toward England, the aircraft absorbed punishment that should have been impossible. German fighters made repeated passes, their cannon and machine gun fire finding the bomber again and again. Flak batteries along the route scored multiple hits. By the time they reached the German border at 3:47 p.m., Lucky Strike looked like it had flown through a shredder. The right wing had so many holes that Patterson, staring out his side window, said quietly, "Mac, I can see through the wing. I'm looking at daylight through metal that's supposed to be solid." The fuselage was perforated from nose to tail, hundreds of holes varying in size from bullet punctures to fist-size flak tears. The tail section looked like lace, the vertical stabilizer so damaged that Harris reported he could see the formation ahead through holes in the metal that should have been blocking his view. Yet every critical system continued to function. All four engines ran smoothly despite visible damage to the cowlings. The hydraulics maintained pressure despite fluid leaking from multiple punctures in the lines. The flight controls responded despite several cables that were nearly severed. The oxygen system continued to flow despite regulators that had been hit by fragments. The electrical system powered all instruments despite wiring bundles that were torn and frayed. It was impossible. It was happening anyway. At 4:23 p.m., Lucky Strike crossed the English coast and began descent toward Thorpe Abbotts. Mac had already radioed ahead, before the radios were destroyed, that they had battle damage, but he had no idea how serious it looked from outside. The formation began to break up as individual aircraft headed for their home fields. and Mac started a shallow descent, keeping power on all four engines because he didn't trust that they'd restart if he reduced power too much. Pilot to crew were about 20 minutes from home. Everybody started thinking about landing positions. Ball, you might want to stay in the turret until we're on the ground. I don't trust the manual extension system if the hydraulics fail. Ball to pilot, understood. I'll ride it out down here. Bombardier to pilot, I'll be in crash position in the nose. If we ground loop, I don't want to be standing up. At 4:41 p.m., Mac lined up on final approach to Thorpe Abbotts, the runway visible ahead, gray concrete stretching through green English countryside that had never looked more beautiful. He lowered the landing gear and felt the satisfying thunk as the mains locked down, watched the green indicator lights confirm that all three wheels were down and locked. He lowered flaps to 20 degrees and felt the drag increase, reduced power slightly, and trimmed for landing airspeed of 110 miles per hour. The B-17 felt strange, heavier on the controls than normal, with an asymmetric drag that suggested significant damage to the airframe. But it was flying, and the runway was ahead, and in 90 seconds this nightmare would be over. Lucky Strike touched down smoothly, the main gear kissing the runway with barely a chirp, and Mac deployed full flaps and began braking gently, letting the aircraft decelerate naturally. At 60 miles per hour, he lowered the tailwheel, and at 40 miles per hour, he turned off the runway onto the taxiway that led to their hard stand. Ground personnel were already running toward the aircraft, and Mac could see their faces through the side window, expressions of shock and disbelief that gradually resolved as Lucky Strike rolled to a stop and Mac began the engine shutdown sequence. Mixture to idle cutoff, magnetos off, master switches off, fuel selectors off, battery off. The silence after 8 hours of engine noise was profound and almost painful, Mac's ears ringing in the sudden quiet. He sat for a moment, hands still gripping the control column, unable to quite process that they were on the ground, that they were alive, that somehow impossibly they had made it home. Pilot to crew, we're home. Nice work, everybody. I don't know how we made it, but we're here. Mac's voice was rough with exhaustion and emotion he didn't try to hide. The crew began extracting themselves from their positions, moving slowly, bodies stiff from 8 hours in cramped quarters at altitude, nerves jangled from constant combat, brains trying to shift from the hyper-focus of survival to the reality of solid ground beneath their feet. Mac climbed down from the flight deck and out through the nose hatch, his legs almost giving out as his boots touched the hard stand. Patterson followed, and together they walked around to where they could see the aircraft properly for the first time. Both men stopped and stared. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Robert Anderson, approached with his maintenance team, and he too stopped and stared. Nobody spoke for nearly 30 seconds. Lucky Strike was destroyed. That was the only word that fit. The aircraft looked like it had been used for target practice by every gun in Germany. Holes covered every surface. The wings, the fuselage, the tail, the engines, the nose, everywhere. Some holes were small, neat punctures from machine gun bullets. Others were ragged tears from cannon shells. Still others were irregular gashes from flak fragments. And there were hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, so many that Anderson said quietly, "How the hell did you fly this thing home? It looks like Swiss cheese. It looks like it should be in pieces across Germany." "Start counting," Mac heard himself say. "I want to know exactly how many hits we took." Anderson assigned his entire maintenance crew to the task, 12 men with clipboards and chalk, each one responsible for a section of the aircraft. They started at the nose and worked their way back, marking each hole with chalk and recording its location and approximate size. The count began: 50 holes in the nose section, 73 holes in the cockpit and flight deck area, including 6 within 2 feet of Mac's head, any one of which could have killed him if it had hit 2 feet to the right, 81 holes in the bomb bay area, 112 holes in the radio compartment, so many that Clark's survival was attributable purely to the fact that he'd been crouched behind equipment when the flak hit, 96 holes in the waist, dozens within inches of where Moretti and Thompson had stood for 8 hours, 67 holes in the tail section, including one that had passed within 3 inches of Harris's head, close enough that he'd felt the wind of its passage. And the wings were nightmare. The right wing had 187 holes. The left wing had 204 holes. Some had punctured fuel tanks, yet somehow hadn't ignited the fuel. Others had severed control cables, yet redundant cables had maintained control authority. Still others had damaged structural members, yet the wing held together. The engine showed battle damage that should have caused immediate failure. Engine 1 had 17 holes through the cowling, including 2 that had damaged cylinders, yet it had run smoothly for the entire mission. Engine 2 had taken a 20mm cannon shell that had penetrated the cowling and exploded against the supercharger housing, yet continued to produce full power. Engine 3, the new engine that hadn't been fully broken in, had 23 holes and had actually run smoother during the mission than it had before. Engine 4 had suffered damage to the propeller governor, yet had maintained RPM throughout. By 6:30 p.m., as the sun set over England and cast long shadows across the hard stand, Anderson's team had finished their count. The maintenance chief approached Mac, who was sitting on the ground with his back against the hangar wall, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "Final count, 187 hits," Anderson said, his voice carrying a tone that Mac couldn't quite identify. Shock, awe, disbelief, perhaps all three. 987 separate impacts on one aircraft. "Captain, I've been maintaining B-17s since 1942. I've seen aircraft come back with 50 hits and be declared total losses. I've seen aircraft with 20 hits that killed entire crews. You brought back an aircraft with 987 hits, and the only injury was Thompson's fragment wound, and that's superficial. I don't understand how this is possible." Max stood up slowly, joints protesting, and walked back over to Lucky Strike. In the fading light, the chalk marks covering the aircraft looked like some kind of terrible art installation, each mark representing a moment when death had come within inches or feet and then somehow missed. "There has to be an explanation," Max said. "Aircraft don't just shrug off 1,000 hits." "I know," Anderson replied. "That's why I called in experts. Boeing is sending investigators from Seattle. The Air Force is sending engineers from Wright Field. Everybody wants to know how Lucky Strike survived." The investigation began the following morning when a team of Boeing engineers arrived from London, followed by Army Air Force structural specialists from the United States. They spent 3 days examining every inch of Lucky Strike, measuring damage, testing systems, analyzing the distribution of hits, and trying to understand how an aircraft that should have been shot down 10 times over had flown for 8 hours and landed safely. The lead Boeing investigator, a middle-aged engineer named Donald Harrison, who had helped design the B-17 structure, stood beneath the right wing on the second day of the investigation and called Mac over. "Captain, I need to ask you something specific. Before this mission, did your crew make any modifications to the aircraft? Anything non-standard? Any changes to equipment placement or structural configuration?" Mac thought carefully. There had been dozens of small modifications over 19 missions. Extra armor plate here, a different ammunition arrangement there, custom mounts for equipment. But one modification stood out, one that had been done specifically before the Schweinfurt mission because Chen had requested it. "The bombardier asked us to move his equipment rack," Max said slowly. "Standard configuration has the navigation and bombing equipment mounted on the starboard side of the nose compartment. Chen said it blocked his view during the bomb run and interfered with his access to the Norden site. We moved it to the port side, completely unauthorized, against regulations, but it worked better for his workflow." Harrison's eyes lit up with something Mac recognized as the expression engineers got when puzzle pieces started fitting together. "Show me exactly where it was moved from and to." Mac climbed into the nose compartment with Harrison and pointed out the original mounting location on the starboard side and the new location on the port side. The equipment rack held the liaison radio set, backup navigation instruments, and various cables and connections. About 150 pounds of equipment that had been moved approximately 4 feet to the left. Harrison pulled out his clipboard and began making calculations, muttering to himself about center of gravity, axis locations, and stress distributions. After 10 minutes, he called down to his team. "Get the structural analysis team up here and bring the damage distribution maps. I think I've found something." Over the next 6 hours, the investigation team assembled what Harrison called the most improbable alignment of circumstances in aviation history. The unauthorized equipment relocation had shifted Lucky Strike's center of gravity by approximately 0.3 inches to the left and 0.7 inches forward from the standard position. This tiny shift, barely measurable, within normal variation for different aircraft, had changed the way the aircraft responded to control inputs by fractions of a degree. When Mac made his normal, practice corrections during formation flying, the slightly altered center of gravity meant Lucky Strike actually flew at angles of attack and sideslip that were different from a standard B-17 by less than 1 degree. That less than 1 degree difference had changed the aircraft's vulnerability profile in ways nobody could have predicted or designed. The Boeing team created a computer analysis using the latest IBM calculating machines in the known locations of every flak battery and fighter attack during the mission. They plotted Lucky Strike's position in the formation, its heading, its angle of attack, its side slip angle, and then overlaid the trajectory of every piece of shrapnel and every cannon shell that had hit the aircraft. The results were impossible to believe and yet undeniable. The modified center of gravity had placed Lucky Strike at angles where incoming fire missed critical components by margins measured in inches. Of the 987 hits recorded, 216 had passed through areas that contained nothing but air and structure. 334 had hit redundant systems where damage to one component was automatically compensated by backups. 187 had struck non-critical areas like empty ammunition boxes or equipment no longer in use. 118 had hit areas where the structure was overbuilt and could absorb damage without failure. 89 had passed through fuel tanks, but at angles and velocities that prevented ignition. 43 had severed or damaged cables and lines that had redundant backups that maintained function. Not one of the 987 hits had struck a critical, single-point failure component. Not one had hit the pilots. Not one had hit the oxygen system's main regulator. Not one had severed all cables for any given control surface. Not one had penetrated the hydraulic pump. Not one had damaged the electrical bus system beyond its redundancy capability. Not one had detonated near ammunition storage in a way that could cause sympathetic detonation. The odds of this happening by chance were calculated by the Boeing team's mathematician as approximately 1 in 47 million. The odds of it happening because of an unauthorized quarter-inch shift in center of gravity that happened to place the aircraft at angles where incoming fire consistently missed vital systems were simply incalculable. "It shouldn't work," Harrison said to Mac on the third day of investigation, standing in front of a wall covered with trajectory plots and damage diagrams. "The modification you made, moving that equipment, shouldn't have any meaningful effect on vulnerability. It's too small, too subtle, too far from the kinds of changes that would matter in aircraft design. But somehow, impossibly, it did. That tiny shift changed your flight characteristics just enough that when fire came in from specific angles at specific times, your aircraft was positioned in ways that protected critical systems by inches. It's not intelligent design. The modification was made for completely different reasons. It's not divine intervention. I'm an engineer. I don't deal in theology. It's simply the most improbable alignment of circumstances, modifications, and geometric relationships I've ever seen. You moved 150 pounds of equipment 4 feet to the left because your bombardier wanted better sight access. That unauthorized modification, that violation of regulations, that tiny change that should have meant nothing, saved 10 lives and brought your aircraft home. I can show you the math, I can diagram the trajectories, I can prove every aspect of how it worked. But I cannot explain why it worked. That's beyond engineering. That's beyond probability. That's beyond anything I understand." The Army Air Force classified the Boeing report immediately. The implications were too disturbing to make public. If a random equipment relocation could mean the difference between survival and destruction, what did that say about all the careful engineering and design that went into aircraft? What did it say about the other crews who had died because their aircraft happened to be at slightly different angles when fire found them? What did it say about combat, about survival, about the role of luck versus skill? The report remained classified for 37 years. Lucky Strike was repaired and returned to service, though the unauthorized equipment modification was not reversed, despite regulations requiring return to standard configuration. Anderson's maintenance team quietly left the equipment where Chen had requested it and nobody in the command chain questioned the decision. The aircraft flew 17 more missions before the war ended and returned safely from all 17, accumulating hundreds of additional battle damage hits, but never suffering a critical system failure. After the war, Lucky Strike was flown back to the United States and eventually ended up in storage at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where it sat among thousands of other surplus aircraft awaiting disposal. In 1914, aircraft dealers began buying surplus B-17s for scrap metal, and Lucky Strike was purchased for $750 by a dealer who planned to cut it up and sell the aluminum. But when the dealer's crew began to strip the aircraft, they discovered the chalk marks that Anderson's team had made, still faintly visible on the aluminum skin, and someone thought to count them. When the count reached 987, the dealer called a local newspaper, and the story of the bomber that had been hit 987 times in one mission and survived began to spread. By 1952, the story had reached Boeing, and the company offered to purchase the aircraft and restore it for display. But the dealer had already sold the engines to a crop dusting operation, the propellers to a fishing boat owner who needed parts, and most of the aluminum skin to a company that made cooking pots. What remained of Lucky Strike, essentially just the center fuselage section and pieces of the wings, was donated to the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where it sat in storage for another 20 years. In 1973, museum staff attempting to identify and catalog stored artifacts discovered the remains of Lucky Strike and began researching its history. The investigation led them to the classified Boeing report, and after appeals to the Air Force and Freedom of Information Act requests, the report was declassified in. The declassified report triggered renewed interest in Lucky Strike's story, and veterans organizations began searching for the crew members. MacMillan had returned to his home in Oregon after the war, worked as a commercial pilot for 23 years, and retired in 1968. When researchers found him in 1981, he was 73 years old and still sharp, still able to recall every detail of that October day in 1943. "People always ask if I knew how close we came to dying," Mac told an interviewer in 1982. "The answer is no. We knew we were taking hits, we knew we were damaged, but from inside that aircraft you can't see the whole picture. You're focused on flying, on staying in formation, on keeping the engines running. It wasn't until we landed and saw the chalk marks covering every surface that we understood how impossible our survival had been. And even then, we didn't know about the equipment modification, didn't know that Chen's request to move his gear had somehow changed our vulnerability profile. We thought we were just incredibly lucky. Turns out we were lucky in a very specific, very technical way that nobody could have predicted or designed." Chen, the bombardier whose equipment request had inadvertently saved the crew, became a professor of mathematics at Berkeley after the war. When informed in 1981 about the Boeing analysis and how his modification had affected the aircraft's survival, he was characteristically analytical. "The mathematics of it are fascinating," he said. "A quarter-inch shift in center of gravity, creating less than 1 degree changes in flight attitude that happen to align with optimal survival angles for incoming fire from specific trajectories. It's a demonstration of chaos theory before chaos theory was formalized. Tiny changes in initial conditions producing dramatically different outcomes. The universe is probabilistic, not deterministic. We happen to exist in the timeline where those probabilities aligned in our favor. In parallel universes, if such things exist, there are versions of us who died that day because the equipment was 3 inches to the right instead of 4 feet to the left." The other crew members scattered across America after the war, living normal lives that bore no external evidence of what they had survived. Washington became a factory foreman in Chicago. Moretti and Thompson opened a restaurant together in Brooklyn. Harris returned to his Iowa farm. Clark became a high school teacher in Kansas. Patterson worked as an aerospace engineer for Douglas Aircraft. O'Brien captained merchant ships until retirement. Kowalski ran an automotive repair shop in Detroit. All of them completed their 25 missions. None of them ever flew in combat again. When the Air Force Museum finally restored what remained of Lucky Strike and put it on display in 1987, 6 of the original 10 crew members attended the dedication ceremony. They stood together in front of the battered fuselage section, old men now, and somebody asked if they stayed in touch over the years. We had a reunion every October 14th, Max said quietly. Every single year from 1945 until guys started dying off. We'd meet somewhere, just the crew, and we'd have dinner, and we'd not talk about the war. We'd talk about our families, our WWIIs, our lives, because that mission that day wasn't who we were. It was just something that happened to us, something we survived together. The real miracle wasn't the 987 hits, or the modified equipment, or the 1 in 47 million odds. The real miracle was that we got to go home, got to have families and careers and normal lives. We got decades that hundreds of other crews never got. That's what Lucky Strike really gave us. Time. Time to become more than just a crew on a bomber. Time to be human. The restored fuselage section remains on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Some of the original chalk marks are still visible on the metal, faint white circles and crosses marking where death came within inches and somehow missed. A plaque explains the basic facts. B-17F, Lucky Strike, 100th Bomb Group, mission to Schweinfurt, October 14, 1943, sustained 987 combat hits. Crew survived. What the plaque doesn't mention is the deeper truth, that survival in combat is never just about courage or skill or engineering. Sometimes it's about a bombardier who wanted his equipment moved 4 feet to the left so he could see better. Sometimes it's about quarter-inch shifts in center of gravity that nobody noticed, creating 1-degree changes in flight attitude that nobody measured, aligning an aircraft with survival angles that nobody could have calculated, protecting 10 lives through an impossible convergence of randomness, modification, and geometry that nobody can fully explain. MacMillan died in 1991 at age 76, having lived 51 years beyond the day when 9 in 87 pieces of German steel tried to kill him and failed. His funeral was attended by 3 surviving crew members. They didn't talk about the mission. They didn't need to. Some experiences forge bonds that transcend words, transcend time, transcend even death. They had flown together through hell and come out the other side because a bombardier moved his equipment rack and the universe aligned in their favor for 8 hours above Germany. That was enough. That was everything. That was the impossible truth they carried until their own final missions ended decades later. Not over German